name is Erin Colligan, and I'm a Senior Program Officer in PCORI's System CER program, and I'm another point of contact for this funding announcement. I'm going to walk through some of the specific features and requirements for the Retrospective Observational Studies funding announcement. Under this funding announcement, PCORI seeks to fund retrospective observational, patient-centered CER studies that will produce timely, impactful results to inform health decision-making and improve health outcomes. Acceptable studies will align with at least one of the topic themes listed here: cancer, metabolic and endocrine health, sensory impairment and disability, rare disease, intellectual and developmental disabilities, maternal morbidity and mortality, managing pain, mental behavioral health, and substance use. The studies will also compare existing interventions that represent a current decisional dilemma, leverage established data sources and structures such as PCORNet, which my colleague Juliana will discuss next, and demonstrate methodological rigor, especially with respect to causal influence approaches required for observational CER. PCORI will allow up to $2 million in direct costs for studies with a project period up to 18 months. As with all PCORI CER studies, applicants are expected to describe research that compares two or more alternatives, each of which has established efficacy and/or is in widespread use. PCORI expects the efficacy or effectiveness of each intervention to be known and cited. If the evidence of efficacy is insufficient, then data need to be provided to document that the intervention is used widely in practice. If you are proposing usual care as a comparator in your study, then it must be described in detail, coherent as a clinical alternative, and properly justified as a legitimate comparator. For instance, if usual care is guidelines-based. And you can see our standards for usual care as a comparator in our methodology standards. Third, applicants must propose research that studies the benefits and harms of interventions and strategies delivered in real-world settings. So the interventions must have been delivered in practice. Simulation studies will not be accepted. And finally, applications must describe consultation with patients and members of the broader health and healthcare community about how the study is answering a critical question. PCORI expects applicants to explain the pertinent evidence gaps and why the project questions represent a decisional dilemma, and most importantly, why the project outcomes are especially relevant and meaningful endpoints to patients and members of the broader health and healthcare community. The PCOTS framework, population, intervention, comparator, outcome, timeframe, and source of data, is an important component of all PCORI studies. You'll be required to complete this table for the LOI, and we also ask that you include your PCOTS if you send us questions or want to request a meeting with the program officer. It helps us to determine if your study is responsive to the funding announcement, and it will help us pair you with the PO best able to answer your questions. For studies under this PFA, the population should be patients with the conditions under the 9 included topic themes. The interventions and comparators should meet the criteria described in the previous slides and should be appropriately captured in the proposed data source. The outcomes should be validated, patient-centered, and relevant to the population study, as well as plausibly linked to the proposed interventions. The timeframe should be sufficient to answer the proposed research question, and the data sources should be existing, ready to analyze data sources such as registries, patient-powered networks, or an existing data network such as PCORNet. Along with the general categories of non-responsiveness, there are important additional restrictions applied to this PFA. These include prospective data collection, research not focused on one of the selected PCORI topic themes, development of a computable phenotype, validation of data definitions for the health condition, study population, comparative intervention, or research outcomes to be extracted from the data set, and development or validation of new data networks, novel data linkages, or novel patient registries. So LOIs proposing any of these activities will be deemed non-responsive. So here are some key considerations for this PFA. First, you must have existing access to the data source at the time of application. You're not required to submit proof of access at the time of the LOI, but will be required to do so should you be invited to submit a full application. And we will, just to note, have an applicant town hall for those who are invited with more details. You must also describe pre-specified data elements to define and identify the study population, interventions, outcomes, and other important variables. If you are awarded a contract under this funding announcement, there are 3 milestones due within the first 3 months that are required for continuing the project. These are 1, a final IRB-approved study protocol, 2, a final statistical analysis plan, and 3, a data report enumerating the number of eligible patients, comparators, and confirmation of sufficient power to address the primary research question. Essentially, PCORI wants to ensure that you will be ready to start data analysis no later than 3 months into the contract period. Failure to successfully meet these milestones during the first 3 months of contract execution will result in a notice of intent to terminate with an option to submit a proposed remediation plan within 30 days. If PCORI does not accept the remediation plan, then the project will not continue. Another important requirement specific to this PFA is that a maximum of 25% of the total budget may be spent within the first 3 months, and no more than 10% of the direct cost budget can be used for data access fees. The PFA encourages, but does not require, assessment of longer-term comparative effectiveness and safety outcomes, for example, outcomes greater than 5 years, leveraging larger samples to focus on populations not easily randomized, rare populations or outcomes, and the exploration of heterogeneous treatment effects. We also encourage leveraging data from multiple health systems or multiple sites within large integrated health systems. As with all PCORI studies, projects funded under this PFA will be required to address the foundational expectations for partnerships and research, as my colleague Christine will discuss later in this presentation, as well as the deposit of de-identified individual-level datasets into the Patient-Centered Outcomes Data Repository, or PCODR. I'll now draw your attention to PCORI's methodology standards, which apply to all PCORI-funded research. I won't go through every one in detail, but just to note, these standards represent minimal requirements for the design, conduct, analysis, and reporting of scientifically valid patient-centered outcomes research. Reviewing these standards will be most helpful during the application phase, but we want to encourage you to look them over as you develop your letter of intent. There are 6 cross-cutting standards in the left column that PCORI expects applicants to fully implement across all study phases. And the standards located on the right column of these slides are study-specific. In some circumstances, it may be appropriate to implement advanced methodologies, such as the study design, modeling, or analytic approaches supported by the PCORI Improving Methods portfolio to provide sophisticated solutions to statistical data challenges in CER. So we do encourage you to look up our methods projects on our website to get some ideas of innovative methods that PCORI has worked on in the past. We rely on applicants to propose a methodology best suited to their research question and provide a clear justification. So we don't make direct recommendations about specific methodologies, but we encourage you to provide a strong justification. And finally, we want to note that PCORI-funded research should consider, as appropriate, the full range of clinical and patient-centered outcomes data. As such, PCORI-funded projects may include the potential burdens and economic impacts of the utilization of medical treatments, items, and services when relevant to patients and caregivers or to members of the broader health and healthcare community. However, PCORI is prohibited from funding research for which costs and economic impacts or the primary outcomes, or studies that include measures of cost effectiveness, cost benefit, or similar economic analysis. Please see our principles for the consideration of the full range of outcomes data, as well as the FAQs on costs and economic burdens for more information.